Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a home to original fantasy stories. Videos are uploaded once a week, feel free to like and subscribe. Enjoy the journey. Chapter 3, Back to the Present. So do you think she has dementia? Asked Shawn as he reached for another sip of his soda. I don't know, that's the problem. She physically can't do what she claims she did, but seems just as surprised as we were at the scene in the bedroom, answered Charles. And there was no one else there, at all? Asked Laurie. No, neighbors saw nothing, and the one across the street, Mrs. Helena Birch, said she'd been watching over them ever since Chloe's second stroke. In fact, on that day, she was the one who phoned 911. Somebody with some decent strength must have done that. You got to think, that ball must have been slammed on the poor guy's head more than once, said Shawn, thinking it over. Jesus, there's a pretty picture, said Laurie, giving Shawn a grotesque look. I need to take my usual time and make a list of all the people involved in this case, speaking to each one of them. The facts as they stand now make no reasonable sense. Chloe simply doesn't have the strength to kill her husband the way she has stated or as the evidence presents. Looking at Shawn, Charles asks, want to tag along and see the genius at work? Hey, that would be exciting and very interesting, replied Shawn. Let's start with the Rose Garden interviewing everyone on their block starting with 543 Blueberry Lane, Charles finished. Shawn had looked towards his wife, with puppy dog eyes, and hoped she wouldn't mind if he left at this hour. I don't mind. Go on. She answered, and then the pair of them left and reached Rose Gardens in no time. Good evening, Mr. Howard. Can we have a few minutes with you to discuss the accident next door? How well did you know your neighbors, the Spencers? Charles asked. I have lived here for years, the Spencers have been great friends and neighbors. However, Ed has been experiencing a more difficult time since Chloe had her strokes, Mr. Howard answered. What about their children, do they visit often? Charles asked. They have one son named Anthony. I don't think that Ed got along with him very well. They did have loud arguments often, regarding his father's relationship with his mother. What else can you add to the relationship of the household? Charles pressed. There were a few odd or maybe weird things that have happened through the years in that house. What sort of weird things? Asked Charles with great interest. Well, maybe I shouldn't say, I mean it might not be odd at all, but for me, it seemed rather strange. Mr. Howard seemed as though he was now regretting saying what was on his mind. You know, I have been doing this sort of work for a very long time, Mr. Howard. Not much surprises me, Charles laughed. Look, a couple years ago a woman claimed that her husband was abducted by aliens. Describe the ship that took him and the clothes they wore. Charles laughed again. It was not aliens, she put her husband through a wood chipper and aliens were her alibi. Well, okay then, said Mr. Howard with a shrug. I've seen her talking Chloe talking to herself often. Ed was normally inside, he hated the heat. It's Arizona, many people do, chimed in Shawn. It doesn't matter what age you are. That's true. But if he wasn't around, she'd be seated outside, by her table with a glass of whatever she had, and would talk as if someone or something was next to her. But you didn't see anything? Asked Charles. No, never. But every time I saw her outside and talking, I would try to approach her, but it never failed, she would spin around and go straight inside. One last question, have you seen anyone approach their house lately, someone who you haven't recognized? Not that I've noticed, no, replied Mr. Howard. Thank you, Mr. Howard, for your time and information. Charles led the way from the doorstep and past the driveway. Well, Shawn, on to the next neighbor. The pair walked over to the Howard's neighbors and readied themselves to pull the same questions all over again. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Redmond, can we speak with you? They talked to 3 more neighbors that night before they called it quits. The next day, Charles picked up Shawn before noon and ended up going up the road to Subway to discuss what they had found out. Charles seemed to be sifting through the papers and making notes as he read through them. Shawn was impressed to say the least, his mind seemed fried still and ready to take a day off and watch some TV or get back to writing his latest reports. They were sitting outside in a shady area around the side of the building. The Subway employees had signs posted on the tables that they were not to be used, and that customers could only be inside if they were in line waiting to order. Sweat was already coming down Charles' forehead, but he didn't seem bothered by the heat. Well, they all say the same thing. Chloe talks to someone but won't say who, and no one ever sees this other person, possibly a thing. Charles began reading out loud his summary. The husband, Ed, is rarely out, but his health seems far better than Chloe's. They have an only son, Anthony Spencer, and he comes to visit once a year during the Thanksgiving holiday. He has 2 children of his own and his wife. Can you think of anything to add? Shawn snapped out of his daydreaming. He was hardly listening and was watching the cars drive past and eating his food in a dull rhythm. Sorry, Ad? No, I can't think of anything, he said quickly. Well, Anthony lives in Palm Springs, and sooner than later he should be here to see his mother. Surely, he'll be needing a good explanation too. Okay, so what about going back and interrogating Chloe? Maybe after a week to process everything, we might get better answers out of her? Shawn looked down at Charles' unopened sandwich. Are you going to eat, or do you like your sandwich toasted? Charles looked from his food to a now smirking Shawn. All right, I got the hint. Sheesh. It's too hot out here anyways, let's eat in the car. They picked up their food and cranked on the air conditioning. Charles phoned the police station to see where Chloe Spencer was being held. The dispatch officer who took his call claimed that she was now in a mental hospital for post-traumatic stress. The officer also gave them the address, and Charles whipped the car around and began speeding off in the opposite direction. They headed for Scottsdale Mental Health and Wellness Institute on East Raintree Drive. It was a large 2-story tan building. The parking lot was surprisingly full, and Charles decided to park in the handicap space. Parking in a handicap spot? Shawn was surprised. Sure, I'm a detective. I do what I want. Charles grinned at Shawn and jumped out of the SUV. They both walked to the nurse's station to inquire about Mrs. Spencer and see if they could speak with her. The nurse at the desk asked for their names and why they needed to see her. Charles showed identification and introduced Shawn as a trainee. She is in room 101, there is a nurse outside her door, you will have to show this permission slip to interview her, the woman politely explained. They did as was instructed when they approached the nurse in front of room 101, and she allowed them in. Chloe seemed fairly lucid, however she did not remember talking to Charles the night of her husband's death. Charles spoke to her in a slow, clear voice, about the night her husband was killed. Oh no, Chloe said. He wasn't killed, he was destroyed by the aliens. Charles asks, do you know these aliens? Of course, I do, very well. They are my only family and I love them very much. She was very calm and seemed to believe the very words escaping her mouth. Charles asks, are they here with you now? Trying to go along with her statement. Yes, they keep me company and protect me from the other aliens. She is here now. Can you see her? Suddenly a small floating person appeared before their eyes. Shawn and Charles were stunned. Shawn sat with his jaw wide open and Charles damn near fell backwards in his chair. Indeed, a small, very human-looking woman, with blonde hair and a green dress was hovering by using 2 small wings on her back. She was no more than a foot tall, but she appeared to be middle-aged. I'm Argatha, the winged little person said to them, and she smiled, but she also seemed guarded, as if not liking that she was put on the spot like that. I'm Charles Woods. Pleased to meet you. Charles almost forgot how to talk in that moment, and he could hardly believe what he was seeing. My name is Shawn Harken and I come from Earth. Please don't eat our brains, Shawn winced as he spoke. Very nice to meet the pair of you, but I am no alien, she answered and slowly landed on the arm of the chair that Chloe was sitting on. Argatha then pointed her index finger towards Chloe's face and said, sleep. Just like that, Chloe was deep in a sleep and snoring ever so softly. I'm no alien. Chloe gets confused and her age doesn't help anything. Age hurts you humans so much, body and mind, but where I come from, time is different, and aging takes much longer. Argatha looked at both Charles and Shawn, who were still at a loss for words. They stared right back at her in hopes that she would continue to explain what exactly she is, so on she went. I am a fairy, known as Argatha, and we fairies do not age, visually past 40 years old, but that's in the realm where I am from called Lufforain. This place is hard to reach from here, but Chloe has managed to get a hold of a bridge that links our 2 worlds. So, another dimension, or universe, is that what you're trying to say? Asked Shawn as his mind had finally caught up with his eyes. I suppose, she answered. So, universe, so is this Lufforain another planet then? So, are you an alien? Now asked Charles. She calls me alien because I am not from this world, so in a sense I am an alien. But really, I'm just another being like yourselves that happens to be here by means of a portal, so to speak. Our worlds are tied together. So can you reveal yourself to anyone you wish? Asked Charles, his detective instincts were kicking in. Yes, she simply said. So that is why the neighbors say Chloe was talking to herself, because you chose not to show yourself. But how did you get here? Charles pressed. The painting in Chloe's closet. That's the bridge from our world to yours and your world to mine, she sighed and eyed Chloe sadly. She was so much more than she is now. Age is truly a curse. She and her husband were like royals in Lufforain. They helped maintain the Brunel forest and all the creatures within it. Saved it from the western trolls of the Hiatus Mountains that wished to expand their empire, but when negotiations failed, they tried to take it by force. Ed led the attack. He was so brave, he rode on the back of a brown bear, named Harmon, and together they tore through the front lines and set the tempo for the rest of the battle. That was too much information at once, Argatha, said Charles as he began fanning his face with a magazine that was sitting on the coffee table that separated him from Shawn. Okay, so Ed was a big shot long ago, and Chloe was assisting in this takeover? Oh yes, she stayed up in the trees with the elves, and they used a bit of their magical trickery to help give us an advantage. Argatha seemed very proud of what the Spencers were and enjoyed telling stories of their glory days, yet as she finished, she returned to look at Chloe with a disheartened look. Okay, they stopped the trolls from getting what they wanted. Did that create some hatred towards Ed and Chloe? Charles paused and thought hard and shook his head. He could barely understand any of this, yet alone make a good assessment on his questionnaire with this very cooperative fairy. What I mean is, do they have enemies? Ones that may want to get back at them or kill either of them? The trolls took it very well. A great feast was held 2 days after they had lost the fight. The king and queen of the Western Kingdom had invited all those from the neighboring villages and creatures of the forest to this feast to celebrate the victory and the treaty that followed. She paused and something struck her in her thoughts that seemed to scare her. Enemies, yes, always. There are the elves of Gorferndain. Elves of what? Shawn couldn't help but chuckle at the name he just heard. Gorferndain, she repeated. They are the oldest race in Lufforain, and think that the bridge into our world should be destroyed so that no outsiders can interfere with the natural shaping of our world. Their world. My world. So, is it possible that one of those elves had actually killed Ed while he was in his bed? Charles asked as he side-glanced at Shawn. It is possible. That might be why she can't remember who did it. The elves of Gorferndain have ancient magic, strong and unchallenged. I have magic myself, as you have seen. I can make myself invisible and make people fall asleep instantly, but I can't do anything savage like they can. Can you two come with me and help find the one responsible for the killing of poor Ed Spencer? He was a very good friend of mine and a great husband to my best friend. We were told Ed was nasty to Chloe at times, and even had arguments with his son Anthony about it. Shawn remembered that key fact. Chloe wanted to return to Lufforain. She kept insisting that they go back and stay there forever and live long and away from the issues of your world. He thought it was wrong, kept telling her not to, that it just wasn't their world. He is right, but I suppose I had a hand in keeping her heart set on returning. I would visit frequently enough and their son was actually on her side. Can you give us a minute or two? Charles asked as he stood up and issued Shawn to follow him out into the hall. Sure, she answered softly. They met in the hallway in between rooms 101 and 103, and Charles began pacing the floor and rubbing his hands together. Shawn felt like doing the same thing, so he too found a spot opposite Charles and tried to absorb what just happened in that room. Charles stopped and knelt. He felt like he couldn't catch his breath. How are you doing, Chuck? Asked Shawn, now rubbing his hands together. I think I might be having an anxiety attack, he said through short breaths. What the hell is going on? Fairies? Really, goddamn fairies? There was a janitor down the hall who just came out of one of the bathrooms and paused to see what was going on. Shawn gave the man a wave and a thumbs up. With another pause, the man turned and went about his business. Hey, it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine, Chuck. Shawn was at a loss for words and looked back in through the small rectangle window of room 101, and saw that Argatha was still sitting on Chloe's knee, who was still fast asleep. Let's go, right now. Are you insane? Said Charles, still struggling to catch his breath. I know it sounds crazy on paper, but this is still a part of your job, right? We explored all the options and our best lead just told us that Ed Spencer's killer is through a painting. Shawn shrugged when Charles looked up and eyed him suspiciously. Let's check it out. Charles shook his head and stood up and looked back into room 101. He glanced back at Shawn and said, "Okay, tell the fairy or Argatha that she is to come with us. Because if she is lying, then we can put her in custody for falsifying intel to a member of the law." "All right," Shawn laughed to himself. Think about it, the comedy in those words. Taking a fairy into custody. Wow. Shawn entered the room and told Argatha the terms in which they will continue the trail to Ed's killer. She politely accepted the terms and flew up to the height of Shawn's shoulder and followed him out of the room. At first, they were worried about escorting a fairy out of the building, but she assured them that only the pair of them could see her and no one else. They got into the car and headed for Rose Gardens. They returned to the Spencer home and there was caution tape all over the front of the property. There was a lock on the front door, but with Argatha there, she was able to unlock it with a touch of magic. Inside, she led them to the closet and moved some hanging clothes aside, and there on the back panel was an oil painting of a little cabin in the woods. The painting seemed as though it was done in a shed just off from the house, because there was a door that swung open and it was very close. There was a small inscription on the bottom and it read, "The Brunel Forest." "So, what now?" asked Charles. "Just put your hand to the painting and the rest will come," she answered. Charles looked at Shawn and gave a grim expression. He held up his hand and, as instructed, put it up to the painting. He went to touch it, but his hand seemed to go right through it. The next moment there was a flash of light and Charles was gone. Shawn looked around the closet and then his eyes caught movement. He focused on the painting, and now a part of the painting itself was Charles Woods and he was in motion. "Your turn," said Argatha. He wasn't sure if it was by her magic or that he couldn't grasp enough of what had just happened to not do what was told of him without question. Shawn followed suit and touched the painting. A flash of light blinded him for a second and then he was standing on the floor of a musty old shed. There were old tools hanging on the wall behind him and an oil painting of the Spencer's closet and master bedroom hung upon the wall at eye level. The inscription on this side read LM14. Another flash and Argatha had entered the shed with them and she smiled. "Thank you so much." She hugged one of their arms at a time to show her appreciation and landed on the roof of the shed with her feet dangling over the side.